The Property Pod. Welcome to The Property Pod with Moneyweb. The property sector is an ever-changing sector. And in this podcast series, your host, Suren Naidu, chats to movers and shakers in the property industry.
Welcome to another episode of The Property Pod, South Africa's premier property investor podcast. My name is Suren Naidu, and on this Moneyweb show, we gain insider insights from leading executives, analysts, developers, and entrepreneurs in the country's expansive property industry. We focus on multiple aspects in this latest podcast, with the World Travel Market Africa having taken place in Cape Town last month and Africa's Travel Indaba, SA Tourism's flagship event, taking place in Durban next week. Plus, it's May, so it's Africa Month. Both events, WTM Africa and ATI, focus on Africa, not just South Africa, and more broadly on the tourism and hospitality industry. So on this latest episode, we take a look at hotels and resorts development in South Africa and the continent. Yes, Africa is a huge continent, so we might not cover everything, but we have an expert on the podcast, as it were, Wayne Godwin, who is CEO of JLL Africa. He is now based out of South Africa, but has held several roles in the industry, including head of hotels and hospitality for Africa and the Indian Ocean at JLL. But now he's got the hot seat, the big position that doesn't only include hotels, but we're going to try to keep it pretty much to that theme for this podcast. This has seen Wayne having direct involvement in a number of SA's large hotel and hospitality transactions. Wayne, that's a bit of a mouthful, but welcome to the Property Pod.
Thank you, sir, and always a pleasure to talk to you and to your listeners. And of course, topic that I love talking about, hotels and hospitality investment in Africa.
Before we go into that, you have a bigger role. You were appointed co-CEO, according to a release from last year that I saw of JLL Africa. That was in February last year. But I see on your LinkedIn profile, you are now the CEO. Most of your experience, as I mentioned earlier, is in the hotels and hospitality space. According to your LinkedIn profile, I see Pam Golding mentioned, Hospitality Property Fund, HTI at one stage, and you also had a stint in Kenya, I believe. What does your new role entail? Is hotel still part of this big CEO position?
Yeah, absolutely, sir. And hotels at the end of the day are real estate, and that's very much the lens through which we look at them at JLL. And yeah, ostensibly been very fortunate to be given the opportunity to lead the wider business, initially in a transitionary role with Emma Late, who's moved to Portugal with JLL, and now looking after the wider business, which is, of course, a number of different business lines that cover all asset classes. Of which hotels and hospitality very much part of that, and still close to my heart and close to my role and focus.
How do you split it, considering it's so close to your heart, because JLL, commercial real estate or office and the three top sectors are quite a big part of the industry?
Of course. No, and absolutely. It's, those are where a lot of the capital sits and most of the focus. But very fortunate to have a great team of seasoned hoteliers and people that have been in the business focusing on hotels in Africa for the last decade to also support me on the hotel side. But yeah, it's certainly a broad industry, right? 54 countries in Africa, lots all happening, and very much sort of a nuanced approach from street corner to street corner that's needed. So yeah, we really try kind of blend the local knowledge and that global reach that JLL offers.
So just off the cuff, JLL, in how many countries is it represented roughly?
Sure. Well, in Africa, our headquarters are in Johannesburg, but we've got offices in Cape Town, Kenya, so Nairobi, obviously, Lagos, Casablanca, and Cairo, and those are sort of our hubs for the region. We cover the wider region from those.
Thanks for that. Turning to the topic at hand, with the WTM Africa having just taken place in Cape Town, I mentioned Idaba next week, but with WTM Africa, the spotlight was a little bit on hotels, the hotel sector, not just tourism. You have been worked across the continent, essentially, considering JLL is an international company. It's quite a broad question, but how is the industry doing? There seems to, my sense is that there seems to be a lot of activity and new development coming up.
Yeah, that certainly holds true. I think if we look back the last few years post-COVID, and of course, COVID was incredibly impactful to the hospitality sector. And we still, as a sector, still very much referencing it as a sort of really sort of pivotal moment in the sector. But I think what we saw from an Africa perspective was somewhat of what needed to happen was a sort of cleaning out of what was sort of a lot of development pipeline that was not necessarily realistic. So if you look at the sort of actual numbers of planned projects, it would appear significantly down pre-COVID. But the reality is actually somewhat different. I think what there has been is a sort of consolidation of quality. So promoters who are able to, are more experienced and stronger are the ones that are active. And, a lot of the sort of projects that we're probably never going to see the light of day, there's fewer of those, which of course is great. I think the sector needed some, a bit more sort of maturity and reality around what it is and the sort of narrative of a huge opportunity across the board for hospitality investment needed a bit more nuance. Absolutely, there's a huge opportunity and we wouldn't do what we do if we didn't believe that. But you've got to be selective and strategic and finding the right street corners, finding the right partners, and the thesis has to be sort of a lot more solid. So I think the stronger players have come through far stronger, and that's ultimately good for the sector because we want that to be the case, to attract other big global players to look at the sector and go, right, there are sophisticated players here. They know what they're doing. There's a roadmap and there's models that benchmarks that show that this works. What we don't want is sort of developments popping up on every street corner with sort of little regard for what's happening around them, and then suddenly lenders are disappointed in their returns, and the sector is kind of painted with a more negative brush. So as hard as the pill and the medicine was to swallow from COVID, I think it's been a good one, absolutely. And I think we're going to see fewer developments across the board, and we'll see better developments. We'll see stronger players and owners being able to invest in their own projects and their own properties, existing properties from a capex point of view to stay more on the front foot, and the sort of weaker owners may sort of struggle, particularly those on the periphery of nodes, and that's where there's probably more investment opportunities not going forward for those stronger players. So it's certainly been a watershed period, but across the board, we're still very bullish on the sector across the region, really. And it's just the sort of nature of the opportunities changed somewhat.
Talking about bullish, you said better quality projects. I don't necessarily want to talk about pipeline because I find a lot of hoteliers are moving away from talking about pipeline per se. But where are you seeing the opportunities? Obviously, this is the property pod. It has a South African bias. But where else are you seeing the opportunities? I'm hoping to get Marriott on the program soon, and I see there's some investment around the safari space, which is what I will focus on when I get them on. But you still have these big players other than Marriott, the likes of Hilton, Accor, Radisson, looking and developing in Africa. Where is that interest coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. And those large global players are still very active and committed to the continent. It's one of the last somewhat frontiers for them to really gain growth and flags across the continent. But I think it's quite important to sort of also present, the investment really happens from individuals, high net worths, multinationals, or regional operators who are actually investing in the bricks and mortar. A lot of these international operators, whilst playing a pivotal role and a sort of irreplaceable role in many senses, they're not the ones necessarily investing. So they're an important partner and fantastic to have their focus on the region. But I think we've seen a really good rise again in interest from regional operators and domestic operators, particularly the last sort of 2 years. They were certainly quite battered and bruised through COVID, but have emerged I think with a bit more sort of ability to use their balance sheets a bit more creatively, and to sort of start looking to grow. And I think we're seeing probably more growth from some of these parties than some of the bigger international brands, who will always be a fixture, right, and will always be looking to grow. But I think the quicker rebound has come from some of these domestic and regional players.
But where are you seeing opportunity in terms of geographies? Like South Africa, you can go to the provinces, but maybe the top 3 or 5 in Africa after that.
Okay, well, starting outside of South Africa, we still see the Indian Ocean as a very strong, very mature and sophisticated market, particularly Mauritius and the Seychelles, quite different from each other. But Zanzibar has really sort of come onto the map the last 3-4 years, with a lot of movement and activity, and now a lot of that development pipeline starting to sort of come on stream. But so the Indian Ocean, absolutely very strong. We've very interestingly seen a rise in interest in lodges and the safari side of things. Now, I think as an asset class, it sort of was always deemed a difficult one to sort of invest into. By its nature, Suren, as you know, I mean, lodges are small and private, so it doesn't necessarily lend itself to larger institutional capital or bigger players. But increasingly, as travel becomes more sort of wellness focused, more holistic, and that is just something as a region, it cannot be replaced elsewhere, right? You cannot replicate Africa's safari option anywhere else in the world. So I think a lot of players are realizing that and looking at how to invest into that. So it's a lot of curiosity, far more than we've sort of ever seen. How much capital will flow into that and how different it will sort of necessarily look, I think it's still a little bit early days to take a call on some of that. But it's certainly good to see a lot of inbound foreign direct investment and focus on the safari circuits, particularly East Africa and Southern Africa. I think the other market that we've seen a huge uptick in activity is Morocco. And I think it's sort of good example of the sort of public sector's policies and stance towards tourism and creating enabling environments that hotels and tourism in general is performing well in Morocco. So naturally investors follow, right? I mean, that's ultimately, it's a very simple sort of process. The more tourists and the more people that want to travel, the better the opportunity from a hospitality perspective. So West Africa certainly had a little bit of a difficult couple of years, Nigeria and Ghana particularly, mainly around the sort of currency impact, less maybe the demand side, but good to see some really good kind of green shoots there this year and some stronger performance than we were sort of anticipating. When it comes to South Africa, yes, I think Cape Town's certainly the main focus from an investor perspective, and just stronger performance fundamentals, because you've got this nice balance between bit of domestic demand, bit of corporate demand, bit of international demand, which obviously thinks and prices in dollars, which sort of helps your room rates, etc. But across the country, I think the sector's in a relatively healthy state. But what is maybe different from previous cycles is there's far more of a sort of flight to quality. So new, well sort of looked after hotels in the center of Rosebank or Sandton performing kind of well. But if you go sort of out to the periphery of some of these nodes, and some of these hotels haven't had much capex or investment the last couple of years, maybe those capex reserves were used for working capital through COVID, and maybe balance sheets are a bit stretched and lenders have kind of put a bit of pressure on some of these parties. Those products are starting to get a little bit tired, and you're seeing a consumer that's quite quick to sort of vote with their feet, and that flight to quality is absolutely there. So when you look at a market on a whole like Johannesburg, you might kind of think, it's not necessarily doing that well, but the difference between the best performing and the worst performing hotel, that gap has increased quite a lot, and that's sort of certainly impacting the sort of average. So anyone who says you can't make money owning a hotel in Johannesburg, certainly that's not true. There's some very good returns being made, and some properties that are performing exceptionally well. It's just sort of more of a mixed bag across the broader region. And in the previous supply cycle, I think we saw a lot more development in some of your secondary and tertiary nodes. The last few years, we've sort of seen very little sort of concentrated in the sort of really prime corners of your major metropolitan nodes, really.
Thanks for that. Interestingly enough, I forget his name, but JLL was involved when Tongaat was still okay with the Club Med development before Collins came in, and it seems they pretty much went with the design that JLL was involved with there. That's quite a big thing. Do you foresee more resort development in South Africa? Because most of it has taken place in, obviously, the Indian Ocean islands like Seychelles and particularly Mauritius.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. And I'm very proud to have supported the Collins Group and Club Med for that matter on that project. And it is absolutely a landmark, hugely exciting development for South Africa at large. You don't have to be in the property sector or the hospitality sector to realize that's a big deal, right? So we worked very closely there. And I think Club Med as an operator is very distinct, and there's absolutely good reason why we feel that resort is going to be particularly successful. Actually, I think the mix of what they've got is very strategic. There's a domestic market that is already traveling to Club Meds around the world that you can tap into. There's just there's not a lot of beach resorts in South Africa. And for a long time, that's sort of been a question mark as to why and what's sort of, is there something we're missing, and we certainly believe that to be the case. And I think the proximity to the airport and the way the Club Med model works was very much they kind of control their own destiny, work with their own tour operators, and sort of from the point of someone being on the high street or walking past a travel agency in Paris to getting into the resort, they really sort of control that process. So I think it's a big deal. It's a catalyst for that North Coast region. And I think the success will definitely spur on more interest from other parties. Look, these are big investments. I think that's probably one of the biggest, if you put aside the V&A waterfront as not being purely hospitality, probably one of the biggest investments in hospitality since Sun City, right? So it's a huge, huge, huge investment. But I think that's really kind of puts it on the map as for the broader region. And there absolutely is more opportunity for those larger developments to happen.
Turning back to WTM Africa, there was a panel session on hotel and resort development. You were one of the people, quite a large panel, or a number of stakeholders involved there, local and international. Can you give us some highlights on what was discussed and what were the main talking points?
Yeah, listen, I think we're very fortunate to have some of the sort of preeminent hotel investors across the region. I think it was, quite an impressive panel. But I think the focus was sort of somewhat taking it back to basics, right, around kind of what the region needs. I think what was good about WTM, which has historically been more of a tourism trade sort of event versus a real estate investor focused event, which there are a number of very good ones across the region. Let's try to sort of bridge the two to bring that sort of investment perspective into the tourism trade and the tourism sector, which is a lot of government and public sector participants as well. And that's ultimately what the focus was, is the message from investors, and whether they're local or international, whether they're institutional or sovereign wealth funds, or whether they're owner-operators, it doesn't really matter. What does Africa need to attract more investment into hotels and hospitality? And I think it was getting to those sort of basics around visas, around travel policies, around airlift, things that sort of as a sector been going on for some time, and there's been some improvements, but like a lot of things, when the money starts talking and asking questions and sort of putting pressure, then it's a somewhat more compelling argument than little old you and me trying to sort of make a case to governments.
Can you give us some insights on some big projects coming up? You are insider. I don't think I'm the small one. You probably hear a lot of what's happening. We know there's 2 big projects at the V&A waterfront, and in Cape Town, the new hotel at Camps Bay is also going to open. The Hilton opened there recently. We've heard about that. Anything interesting coming up that we don't know about, that, you maybe can't mention the brand, but, where the interest is coming and, potentially in other parts of the country?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. No, there certainly is a number of projects, and not only from the international players, I think. But I think we should start to see some more sort of repositioning projects. So maybe a hotel that's kind of needs some capex, and it's not just a sort of simple refurbishment, it's a rebranding, it's a repositioning, etc. And I think we'll see that with some of the bigger South African owned operators, some of them listed, some not, privately held. But I think watch that space quite interestingly. I think a number of them are sort of in a position where they're now able to push forward quite aggressively potentially. And I think there'll be some exciting projects that kind of are born out of those stables.
Before you go, will you be at Indaba? The reason I ask, there's a couple of events coming up from a pure tourism investment perspective. One of them is also in Cape Town in June that JLL is involved with, but I know there's another one later in the year up on the North Coast. Do you want to share a little bit of that before you go?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure we'll be certainly at all of those. I think it's important. I'm flying up to Nairobi now to EAPI. There's API in Mauritius, and I think these sort of platforms are important for sort of the sector to come together and to sort of realize how we can better position the offering and the opportunity to players overseas. And I often kind of feel that at our scale, which I mean we're talking maybe 1% of global hotel rooms are in Africa, and sort of 1% of investment into hospitality. In that sort of environment, there's no competitors, right? We all sort of have the same agenda. If Africa has 17% of the population and will have, 25% within the next sort of 2 decades, it's really about how industry mobilizes together to align these sort of metrics and to take advantage of the opportunity. And I think those sort of forums are good from that perspective to bring some transparency and to try and bring the sectors together in sort of the common objective.
Wayne, I appreciate your time on the podcast. That was Wayne Godwin, the CEO of JLL Africa.
Thanks for listening to the Moneyweb Property Pod with Suren Naidu. To listen to more episodes, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Follow Suren on Twitter @Suren Naidu for more of his property industry content and other business stories. The Property Pod.
Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.